So it has reached the 7 o'clock hour. I want to welcome you all to tonight's webinar, The Life in a Leaf, The Wonderful World of Leaf Miners, presented by our very own Charley Eiseman. My name is Corey Wren. I'm the TerraCore member at Mount Grace this year, and I'll be moderating tonight's webinar. So without further ado, I want to introduce Charley Eiseman, our presenter. Good evening.
Hey, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining me. This is a great opportunity to talk to people all over the world. The focus is going to be North American leaf miners, but a lot of this should apply wherever you are. So I saw there were a lot of enthusiastic amateurs on there. That's what I am. I don't have a degree in entomology or anything. I'm just some guy who likes bugs. So that's probably enough about me. I'll just jump in to the wonderful world of leaf miners. So what is a leaf miner? This is a great little video, slightly sped up, made by Mike Palmer, who's a botanist until recently in Oklahoma. Now he's in Oregon. He's been making all kinds of great discoveries of leaf miners. But a leaf miner is an insect larva that lives and feeds between the epidermal layers of a leaf, so inside the leaf. You can see this little guy here. There's his mouth wiggling, or his head wiggling back and forth, munching away all the inner tissue of the leaf. And all the while that he's doing that, or she, the rear end is wiggling back and forth and very, very carefully placing little fecal pellets back and forth. So what to the naked eye would appear to be a continuous central line of frass is actually all these little carefully placed pellets. And I became fascinated with leaf miners when I realized that just how diverse they are and how specific they are in their food choices and their habits, that you can often identify them to species just by knowing what the host plant is and by studying the characteristics of the mine. I could watch this guy munching away all day, but that linear mine is just one type of, one example of the form of a leaf mine. So this is something made by a moth in the same genus here. This is a single oak leaf with mines of 3 different moth genera on it. So some mines can be linear like that. They're blotch mines. In this case, most of the frass is deposited in a central spot, but there are also scattered pellets all throughout. And then this is another blotch mine, but if we flip the leaf over, you can see that that one is mainly visible on the lower surface, that the first blotch mine is mostly visible on the upper surface, and the linear mine is kind of visible all the way through, but more visible on the upper surface. And if we look at the cross-section of a leaf, we can see what's going on there a little more clearly. A leaf, you'd probably think of a leaf as just this thin thing. How could it possibly have any internal structure that a caterpillar could move up and down in? But there's actually, so there's this waxy cuticle on the upper and lower surface, and then just inside that is what's essentially the skin of the leaf, this single layer of epidermal cells, upper and lower epidermis. And then sandwiched between those 2 epidermal layers, there are 2 types of inner tissue. There's the palisade mesophyll, which is densely packed cells in the upper half. And then there are these more loosely scattered spongy mesophyll cells. So that larva that was making the upper surface blotch was mainly feeding just in this palisade mesophyll, and that one making the lower surface blotch started out its life just living in the lower epidermal cells, and then as it got older, it started eating in the spongy mesophyll and then started picking out little bits of the palisade mesophyll, and that's why you see the speckling here. So this is 2 views of a larva that I removed from one of those upper surface blotch mines. Below is the top view, and above is the side view. This is resting on a sheet of paper. So you can see it's about as thick as the paper is. Its body is about as thick as the paper, but its head is this narrow little wedge that it can use to pry open the leaf as it plows through it. And here is another video by Mike Palmer showing how a blotch mine is made. This is in a clover leaflet. And this larva here is just kind of moving around at random, little nibble here, little nibble there. It seems like that area right there was extra tasty. It spends most of the rest of the video just feeding right there. So far I've just shown examples of leaf miners that are moths, but leaf miners include 4 orders of insects. In North America, there are about 40 species of leaf mining sawflies, just over 200 species of leaf mining beetles. There are at least 600 and probably closer to 1,000, if not more, species of leaf mining flies in North America. And there are over 1,200 species of leaf mining moths, which is about 1 out of every 10 described species of moths in North America. And then there are hundreds of others that don't have names yet. So 10 years ago, my friend Noah and I wrote this book, Tracks and Sign of Insects and Other Invertebrates. And there are several chapters devoted to different things bugs do to plants and how you can identify them by the signs they leave. There's a 32-page chapter devoted to leaf mines, but not long after the book was published, I decided I really wanted to know exactly what every leaf mine was, not just approximately. So I wrote this book, which only exists in electronic form at this point, and I don't know if it will ever be a physical book for several reasons. One is it's nearly 2,000 pages long, and it would be prohibitively expensive to print or buy because of all there are color pictures on every page. And the other main reason is I wanted to be able to keep updating it regularly. In fact, I'm already in the process of issuing the updated and revised 2nd edition, which I'm putting out a month at a time. Oh, and there was a request ahead of the webinar from someone who has this book, who asked if I could do a couple of examples of keying something out using my book. And if there's time at the end and if there's interest in that, we can try a few. But my main purpose with this webinar was not to be an infomercial for my book. It's just to share the diversity of leaf miners and get people excited about those. So the rest of this talk will be going through those 4 groups of leaf miners and showing some examples of what their minds are like and what their biology is like. So starting with the smallest group, the sawflies. Sawflies are not flies. They're in the order Hymenoptera, which also includes ants, bees, and wasps. And the reason the saw is in their name is that the females have a serrated ovipositor, a saw-like ovipositor that they use to insert their eggs into tissue of their host plants. So this is one inserting eggs into the edge of a purslane leaf. And the larvae are miners in purslane. They make these blotchy mines. Little green larvae in there. And most sawfly larvae feed belly up. So these little black dots you can see are its legs sticking out to the side. And some will have dark plates on the ventral surface of their thorax that you can see on the upper surface of the leaf. Nearly all leaf mining sawflies exit their mines when they're ready to pupate. And that's what this one has done here. And they generally burrow into soil and make a pupal cell there. But this particular one, I just had some damp paper towels in the rearing container, and they pupated in those. So we can see what the pupae look like. This little brown thing here is the larva's shed skin, and then inside that was the pupa, which has free appendages, unlike, say, a butterfly chrysalis. And that species that mines purslane leaves is Schizosorella pilocornis. It's I think it's the only one in North America, and I believe the only species in the world in the family Argidae. That's a leaf miner. The males have these kind of antler-like antennae. All of the other leaf mining sawflies are in the family Tenthredinidae. And there are basically no common names in this talk because most leaf miners don't have common names, and the common names that do exist tend to not to be very helpful. Like there's one that's called the goldenrod leaf miner, but it mines in plants other than goldenrod, and there are 30 other species of insects that mine leaves of goldenrod. So not a very informative name. Within the family Tenthredinidae, there are two different groups of leaf miners. One is this tribe Pseudodineurini, which are entirely leaf miners of herbaceous plants, and the genus Pseudodineura are all miners in plants in the buttercup family. So this particular species, Pseudodineura parva, mines leaves of anemones. I found these little mines one day, and this is wood anemone, Anemone quinquifolia. There's a little mine there, there's one there, one there. So almost every leaflet here has a mine getting started in it. And at the time I found this, there wasn't an insect known to mine leaves of wood anemone, so I was excited to see that, and I dug up this little plant and put it in a pot. You can see the edge of the pot there, and the mine's expanding. And it turns out that Pseudodineura species, unlike most other leaf mining sawflies, have the ability to move to a fresh leaflet or leaf if they mine out their initial leaflet, as this one is done here. So this is an entirely mined out leaflet, and this here is the larva mining into a new leaf. And here's a side view of that same scene with the larva just hanging out the back there. So not all leaf miners are as flat as that first one I showed you there. Some have to just squeeze in, and they end up making puffy mines because they're stretching out the leaf. So that's often a sign that you're looking at a sawfly or a beetle if the mine looks very puffy. Okay, that's my one example of the Pseudodineurini, and then I'll show a couple of sawflies in the tribe Phenucinae, which are the main group of leaf mining sawflies. And these are mostly leaf miners in trees and shrubs, but a few are also on herbaceous plants. The genus Beetles are all leaf miners of the Rosaceae, the rose family. There are 3 species on rubus and one on geum, which is avens. But Beetles raueri feeds on blackberries, and there's another species that's just on raspberries, and one that's on, that seems to just be on swamp dewberry. But here is a mine of Beetles raueri. A lot of sawfly mines have this kind of trumpet shape where they start out narrow and turn into a wider blotch. And sawfly larvae have a very coarse and copious frass that's usually scattered all throughout the mine. And there again is the larva feeding belly up, and you can see its ventral thoracic plates there. And sometimes different species will have different patterns there that help you distinguish them. This is a Phenucella nana, a birch miner. I peeled open the upper epidermis to see the larva inside lying on its back. And this species, for whatever reason, its fecal pellets are all strung on this long chain of silk, like pearls. I guess it helps keep the mine tidy so they're not just swimming around in their own poop the whole time. It kind of keeps it bunched together. So as part, I didn't explain anything about how I put this book together, but over the past 8 years or so, my wife Julia and I have traveled all over the US and a little bit in Canada to collect photos, since I wanted to make a guide to all North American species, not just the ones in my yard. And this picture shows a plant that in Washington is called huckleberry, which is a little confusing to me being from New England, because here huckleberries are the genus Galusacia, but the Pacific Northwest huckleberries are vaccinium, which are the same genus as blueberries. But in any case, there's a lot of this huckleberry around, and we were noticing these blotch mines that when backlit, they could see they had these discrete pellets of frass that looked a lot like sawfly frass, but there was no sawfly known to mine leaves of vaccinium. So we collected a bunch of those to try to find out what they were. The larvae popped out and burrowed into soil, and the next spring I got a single adult, which luckily was a female, because you tend to need female sawflies to identify them to species. And this was a new species, which Dave Smith and I named Pseudodineura vaccinii. And I'll be mentioning a lot of new discoveries throughout this slideshow, and it's not just to say, look at me, I've found all these new things, but it's just to point out how much there is left to be discovered, literally in your own backyard, wherever you are, but especially if you're in the Western US, but really everywhere. Okay, so that's it for my sawfly overview. I'm going to move on to beetles. There are three main groups of leaf mining beetles. The first being the Chrysomelidae, which are known commonly as the leaf beetles. And these kind of pointy-headed ones are known as hispines. They used to be the subfamily Hispinae, but now they're the tribe Calypinae within the tortoise beetle group. Anyway, we call them hispines. And this species, Sumatrosis inequalis, feeds on various plants in the aster family. And a lot of beetles make mines kind of similar to sawfly mines. There was virtually no published information on the characteristics of beetle mines. So I had to figure a lot of this out myself just by raising things and looking at the differences. But this species, can't really see the egg there, but it lays its egg, it chews a little pit in the leaf, and it embeds its egg in that pit. And then the larva makes a blotch mine with this very fine, stringy frass, just scattered pretty randomly throughout. And all of these hispine beetles pupate inside their mines. There's another species on asters that, instead of scattering its frass all throughout, it puts most of it in the central black circular area, which ultimately becomes this inflated blister that it pupates inside. And that species is Microropella zerini, these fancy racing stripes. And then there are a couple of species in the genus Calypus that are grass feeders, and they all push their frass out of the mine. So that's what all this squiggly stuff here is at regular intervals. It's just pushing some frass out the edge of the leaf. And this is a leaf of deer tongue grass, Dicanthelium clandestinum. That's the adult from that mine. And pretty much all of the leaf mining beetles also as adults feed on the leaves of their host plants, but externally. And they often have characteristic signs that you can use as circumstantial evidence to identify the mine you're looking at. So if you see these perfect little squares like this on various broad-leaved grasses, like this particular one was on Canada blue joint, that's a sure sign you're looking at Calypus walshii, adult feeding sign. And there's one that I caught in the act. All right, moving on to another group of chrysomelid beetles, the flea beetles. These all have yellow larvae and feed, I think, all on herbaceous plants. That's what's coming to mind right now anyway. And a lot of them make linear mines with very squiggly frass. This particular one is in a white turtle head leaf, Chelone glabra. And you can see here that the larva started out making this very squiggly, loose frass, but then when it rounded the bend and came around the tip of the leaf back the other side, it started making a more contracted central frass line. But all of these flea beetles have yellow-orange larvae that exit their mines and burrow into the ground and then emerge as adults a few weeks later. Just have one generation per year. And they're called flea beetles because the adults are little and jumpy. They like fleas. They have big hind legs that help them jump around. So Dibolia chelones or chelones is the turtlehead feeder. There's a really common species on plantain, and this whole genus Dibolia is on plants in the order Lamiales, so the snapdragon family and figworts, plantains, things like that. This plant here is Epigea ripens. It's the Massachusetts state flower, known as Mayflower or trailing arbutus. And it has evergreen leaves. It's a ground cover. And one January, I was taking a hike on the ridge above, well, where I now live. I didn't live here at the time, but it's just a short walk from my house. I noticed these brown patches along the edges of some trailing arbutus leaves. And if I hadn't had leaf miners on the brain, I would have just thought the leaf was randomly dying at the edge, or maybe frostbite or something. But I picked up the leaf and held it to the light and could see that there was a larva inside and frass inside. But also, just looking at the photo, you can see a clue, which is this little shiny circle here, which is an eggshell, which is characteristic of the leaf miners in the family Buprestidae. Here's that same leaf backlit, so you can see the larva there and all its scattered frass. So I saved that leaf, and a few months later saw this adult beetle starting to chew its way out of the lower epidermis. And this, I showed this beetle to Henry Hespenheide, who's a specialist in buprestid beetles. And he said that it was an undescribed species that Henry Howden had reared several decades earlier. And he said if I could get him a half dozen or so, he would describe it. So I did, and he did. He named it Brachys howdeni. So the Buprestidae are mostly wood-boring beetles. So they're known as the metallic wood-boring beetles or the jewel beetles. The emerald ash borer is one of the most famous species, but there are lots of native species that don't cause widespread destruction. And there are a few dozen species that are leaf miners. So this, if you're familiar with what buprestid wood-boring larvae look like, the leaf mining larvae look very similar, kind of wide thorax and then a little wedge-shaped head, no legs. And the Brachys adults have their own characteristic feeding sign. They eat these ragged channels in from the margins of the leaves. Most Brachys species feed on oaks, as far as we know. This is a whole bunch of adult Brachys feeding on a red oak leaf. All right, and our third group of beetles is the weevils, Curculionidae. The genus Orchestes is the one I most often run into. They're on various woody plants, and the females chew a little pit in the underside of the midrib and lay the eggs there. So there are 2 eggs laid in this leaf, and the larva starts out by making a narrow linear mine that eventually reaches the tip of the leaf and turns into a blotch. And then this spherical cocoon is spun inside the leaf. And this is a pupa I removed from that cocoon. You can see its little weevil snout there. There's the adult. That was a musclewood leaf, but the species Orchestes mixtus feeds on essentially anything in the birch family. And there's an essentially identical weevil, Orchestes palicornis, that is on various rosaceous trees and shrubs, apples and cherries and such. This is a Virginia creeper leaf that I found one August when I had a job crawling around in swamps in southeastern Massachusetts doing botanical surveys, but I I bumped into this leaf and I knew there were no leaf mines on Virginia creeper that looked like this. So I was intrigued and I spent about half an hour looking for more mines. I only found a total of 3 mined leaves. But there are these coarse linear mines with little yellow larvae inside, unfortunately partially obscured, at least on my screen, by this window here. But totally unlike any mine I'd seen on any plant, in that there seemed to always be 2 larvae mining side by side, so they made this distinct double frass line. And when I stuck them in a jar, and a few days later, these larvae popped out, and I wasn't even sure what order I was looking at. This pear-shaped thing with no legs, and this little brown head. But I gave it some soil to burrow into, and it went in. And then a couple weeks later, this adorable little roly-poly weevil bubbled to the surface. And I sent it to Bob Anderson, who's a weevil specialist in Canada. And he identified it as Orchestomerus wickemi, which is had been described in 1896 from, I think, a single specimen from Brownsville, Texas, and nothing had been published about it since then. So I published my first peer-reviewed journal article, just a short note documenting the natural history of this species. And shortly after that was published, Bob wrote to me and he said, I just dissected your weevil and it's very different from Orchestomerus wickemi. So he and a Japanese colleague ended up doing a revision of this genus, and they determined that in fact, Orchestomerus wickemi is only in Brownsville, Texas, presumably also Mexico. But every other specimen that had been masquerading as that species throughout the eastern US was actually this new species, which they named Orchestomerus Eiseman after me. And even before that happened, it was one of my favorite animals, just because the adult is so adorable, and they have these unique little, the larvae feeding side by side. So I'm always excited to see their minds. I seem to live just outside the geographic distribution of this species. All right, that's it for beetles. On to the flies. The family Agramizidae are known as the leaf miner flies, but there are at least 10 families of flies in North America that have leaf mining species, and they're about a quarter of the Agramizid flies are not leaf miners, so common names can be a bit misleading, but certainly most North American leaf mining flies are in this family. The females have these conical ovipositor sheaths, and they have a little needle-like ovipositor that comes out of that, and they insert their egg into the leaf. And this is a close-up of a leaf where a female has inserted 3 eggs, and this is the beginning of a communal mine made by these 2 larvae from those 2 eggs. But all these other dots are other places where she stuck her ovipositor, and that was not to lay eggs, but just to make the leaf bleed so she could drink its juices. This is known as host feeding, and that's a good indicator that you're looking at an agramizid fly mine if you see that nearby. Essentially, all leaf mining fly larvae are, well, all of them are legless, and most of them are headless. So this is the mouth end here, and these are breathing structures, the spiracular horns. And the so-called higher flies, so the ones that have a body shape like a house fly, instead of shedding the last larval skin to pupate, the skin just hardens around them and forms what's called a puparium. And this can be formed, depending on the species, either outside the leaf or inside it, in which case often the anterior spiracular horns project through the epidermis. And because adult flies don't have chewing mouth parts, they need some other way to escape their puparium. And I never in a million years would have guessed that this is how they do it, but they have this balloon that pops out of their forehead and just busts open a door on their puparium, and then they wriggle their way out. And this balloon is called the tilinum, and it's kind of pumping in and out as they wriggle their way out. And then it recedes into a suture in their forehead, and it never comes out again for the rest of their life. So when a fly first emerges, it's all pale and its wings are all crumpled up, but within a few minutes, its wings have expanded. And then within a few hours, it's all nicely colored in. This plant is fleabane, erigeron, and it's one of the first wildflowers that popped up in our lawn when we didn't mow it, which is basically what we did as soon as we moved in. And so as soon as I noticed this plant, I ran over to it to see what leaf miners were on it. I found 3 different species of leaf miners on this one plant, but one of them was an agromyzid fly, recognizable by the headless, legless larvae, but especially the frass pattern, which is the alternating on either side of the channel. So the moths, beetles, and sawflies that make linear mines, they're all either feeding belly down or belly up, and so they're leaving a central frass line. But the agromyzid fly larvae lie on their sides, and they poop on one side, and then they roll over and poop on the other side. So they make these very characteristic either strips or grains. Here you can see sort of more separated grains, and over there. In any case, when you see that, you're definitely looking at an agromyzid fly mine. So this particular one popped out of the leaf and made a shiny black puparium, an indicator. If you see a black puparium coming out of a plant in the aster family, you're likely looking at something in the Phytomyza albiceps species group. And this one turned out to be a new species, which the Canadian dipterist Owen Lonsdale helped me describe. We've now named 50 or so leaf miners from all over the US, but at least 5 came from our yard. So not all agromyzid flies make linear mines. This is an example of a blotch mine, again with the stippled pattern from the host feeding female. This is a wood nettle leaf, Laportia canadensis. And the fly I reared from that mine was one that had been named in 1969 from Canadian specimens, but its host was unknown. And that, yeah, just to give you an idea of how much is left to learn, although nearly half of the agromyzid flies, their hosts are unknown, I still more often find new species than I find natural history information for a species that already had a name. So I'm almost more excited when that happens than when I find a new species. So some agromyzid flies make entirely linear mines, some make blotch mines, and then there's some that make what are called linear blotch mines, where the first instar or two makes a purely linear mine, and then it suddenly, after its, say, second molt, it suddenly starts making a blotch mine. And so one larva made this here, and then another one made this, where the initial linear part was totally obliterated. This species, Amoromyza flavifrons, is found on various plants in the pink family. And you can see why its name is flavifrons, that yellow face. And there are some agromyzids that make trumpet-shaped mines similar to some of the sawfly mines. This one is Nemoromyza posticata, which is on all sorts of asteraceous plants. This was a goldenrod. It just looks like kind of a plain brown mine to the naked eye, but if you backlight it and look really close, you can see this amazing herringbone pattern of, these are called feeding lines, but it's basically little tooth marks of the larva's mouth hooks scraping away at the tissue. That's an adult Nemoromyza posticata. Basically a plain black fly, but it has this white tipped abdomen, which is distinctive. All right, so I haven't been mentioning the sizes of any of these things, I realize, but they're mostly like 5 millimeters or smaller. The agromyzid flies are mostly 2 millimeters or so long. But this next family of flies, the Anthomiidae, are more like, including the wings, that are approaching a centimeter. So you definitely notice them buzzing around. A lot of species in the genus Pegomya are leaf miners in the Caryophyllales, which is the order that includes the buckwheat family and the pink family, the amaranth family. They, instead of inserting their eggs like the agromyzid flies, they lay these beautiful reticulated eggs on the underside of the leaf. And the larvae mine directly from the egg into the leaf. This is a bitter dock leaf with a big blotch mine made by multiple Pegomya larvae. And there's another Anthomyid genus, Cheirosia, that are all they're all associated with ferns, and some of them are leaf miners, like this one on interrupted fern, again with a white egg on the underside. This is a Cheirosia larva, and the adult of the Cheirosia felicis is on both interrupted and cinnamon ferns. And I had to work out many of these host plants. Luckily, someone fairly recently revised this genus, so the species, all of the ones I've reared have had names already, but most of them, their hosts weren't known before. Now this, one summer I was doing natural resource inventory work along the Maine coast, and I found this interesting little wetland that was dominated by sedges and sphagnum moss and this neat plant called buckbean. So I wanted to thoroughly characterize this plant community, so I was collecting little samples, and I took a pinch of duckweed and I stuck it in a vial to look at under a microscope and identified a species when I got home. And when I got it under the microscope, I discovered that there was a larva inside this thallus here. So a duckweed leaf, if you're not familiar with the plant, is just 3 millimeters or fewer long. And these leaves here have already been mined out. I was aware that there was a weevil and several species of flies that were duckweed miners, but I had never looked for their mines before. A close-up of that one with the larva inside, and then looking around, I found maybe a dozen of them just in this one pinch of duckweed I collected. This one has formed a puparium, and here's another puparium where you can see the developing fly inside, its 2 little red eyes. And what emerged turned out to be none of the 3 known duckweed leaf mining flies in North America. This was a species that was previously only known from Europe, and it's unclear if this is a recent introduction or just the fact that no one in North America studies this fly family. But Ephydridae is the shore flies, and Hydrelia is a genus that's entirely leaf miners of aquatic plants.
So Charlie,
yes.
Can one generalize that if one species in the genus is a leaf miner, all species are?
Often that's true, but there are any generalization you make about leaf miners, there will be some exceptions.
Right.
But that's generally true.
Okay.
This plant here is marsh marigold. There was another summer or spring, Julia and I were conducting surveys for 4-toed salamanders in the Berkshires, and we were wading through this patch of marsh marigolds when we noticed these little brown lines coming from the center of the leaf. And investigating a little bit, we saw that they continued down the petiole. We peeled one open and found these little legless larvae inside with black heads. So I said that most fly larvae are headless, but there are a few midges and things like that that do have a distinct head capsule. So over there is the head of this one. I collected a gallon of these and was able to get a few to pupate. And the adult that emerged, this is another family that essentially no one in North America studies, the dark-winged fungus gnats, but I sent what I had reared to a couple of German guys who were happy to help and determined that this was a new species. The first known species of leaf mining dark-winged fungus gnat in North America. And Julia and I have since found a second one which mines leaves of blue bead lily, Clintonia borealis. All right, and the rest of the talk will be moths, which, as I said, there are over 1,200 species. These actually belong to at least 40 different families. So many, many different groups have converged on leaf mining as a lifestyle. I'm not going to cover all 40 families. I'm not even going to mention this family, Pseudodineurini, other than to point out that the adults are fancy. So the largest family is Gracilariidae, which has something like 320 described species, well over 100 known but undescribed species, and plenty more unknown undescribed species. They all start out as what are called sap feeders, where the larvae are just slashing open cells and drinking the liquid contents rather than consuming any tissue. And this genus that I'm showing first does that throughout its life, and often living just in the epidermal layer. So they make entirely linear mines, pupating in a little cocoon at the end. And because it's an epidermal mine where it's not consuming any tissue, it's number one, has this silvery appearance when you're looking at it from the outside, and then backlit, it's no more translucent than the surrounding leaf tissue. All you can see in the backlit view is this narrow central liquidy frass trail. And then the pupa pokes out of the cocoon when the moth is ready to emerge. So this is the genus Phyllochnistus, and that particular one was on a plant called swamp dog hobble, Eubotries racemosa, used to be the genus Leucothoe. This is an undescribed species, another one I found when I had that swamp crawling job in southeastern Mass. The other gracilariids make blotch mines. So this particular one on bayberry there's the larva there with a transverse stripes on it. But this one is Cameraria picturatella. But generally, those upper surface blotch mines are going to be the genus Cameraria. Well, that's a dangerous statement, but generally Cameraria mines look like that, let's say that. And these moths are about 3 millimeters long. There are about 30 species of Cameraria on oaks, and then there are others on other woody plants like poison ivy. This particular mine was made by 2 larvae. There are some gregarious feeding species, some of which make these neat little circular silken chambers that they overwinter inside. And then there's another genus, Phylloneuricter, this was one of the species like Cameraria that was on that first white oak leaf I showed that had 3 different mines on it. So the upper surface mine was a Cameraria, the lower surface mine was a Phylloneuricter. And I said how they start out making an epidermal blotch mine on the undersurface. So that's what's happening here. There are 3 different mines. You can see the larva in that one. So initially a sap feeding larva, and then after a few molts, it becomes a tissue feeder and also starts spinning silk. So it's making a deeper mine in the same area, and it's spinning silk that as it contracts, as it dries, it contracts and causes the leaf to buckle, forming this underside tentiform mine. So this is the lower surface view here, upper surface view of the same leaf, and that's the pupil skin poking out the edge of the leaf, edge of the mine rather, when the adult emerged. This was an arrowwood leaf. viburnum dentatum, so the moth that comes from it is Philoneuricter viburnella. There are at least a dozen Philoneuricter species on oaks, and you can identify a few of them by what they do, their style of making a cocoon. So this species, when I collected it and saved it till it made a cocoon, it ended up collecting all its, or a bunch of its frass and making a ring around its cocoon. So that identified it as Philoneuricter basis strigella. Whereas this one already differed a little bit externally in having this central crease on the underside where basis strigella is just flat on both sides. But this one, when the larva was mature, it collected all of its frass and made a little central bundle. So that's its cocoon removed from the mine. It's just this big ball of all its poop with silk on the inside. Not all gracilariids are leaf miners throughout their lives. So the genus Calyptilia, most species just mine for the first instar or two. This one made a tiny underside tentiform mine in a gooseberry leaf, and then it popped out and walked a few millimeters and then used silk to roll the tip of the leaf into this cone. And these patches here are where it's feeding externally, but within its leaf shelter. And virtually all Calyptilia species feed in that way. And that one on gooseberry is another undescribed species. All the Calyptilias have this very upright posture, and they're often purple with a yellow triangle, but they have all kinds of different patterns. So I showed that mine on arrowwood viburnum a moment ago, and that was the only known mine on gracilary, or a leaf mine of any kind on arrowwood. So when I found this linear mine on arrowwood on Nantucket several years ago, I had no idea what it was. And when I went back the next year, I looked for more and I found more examples, and I realized that each one, it has squiggled around the leaf blade, but eventually reached the midrib and then went down and into the petiole and then into the stem. So I cut a few twigs and stuck them in a Ziploc bag, and this one tiny larva popped out. And I wrote to Dave Wagner and Don Davis, who are the people you ask about this sort of thing. And I said, does this look like a marmara larva to you? And they said, yeah, it does. So there are a few leaf mining marmara species, but most are stem miners, and none were known to start as a leaf miner and then move into the stem, and none were known from viburnum. So this required some more investigation. So Julia and I went back to Nantucket a third year and did find mines on the stems of some arrowwoods, but we weren't quite sure what to do about this because most marmara species have this year-long life cycle where they lay an egg in the summer, and then the larva is slowly feeding through the winter into the following spring. And then most of them, when they're mature, they pop out of the stem and wander away to spin their cocoon. So the only way to and most of these we noticed when they went down the petiole, they just kind of disappeared. They were too deep in the stem to see a mine like this. So we couldn't just go looking for nearly mature mines in the spring. So instead, this is what their cocoons look like that they spin away from the plant. They're decorated with these little frothy bubbles, which are anal secretions that have these hexagonal reticulations on them. No one's quite sure what those are for, but they're characteristic of certain gracilariid cocoons. Anyway, so that being the case, what we came up with as a way to try to rear this was to flag a bunch of plants that had the leaf mines on them. And then Julia went back in December and dug up some plants and made these neat little bags for them that we kept in our shed over the winter. And then we brought them into our kitchen in the spring to see what bugs would emerge. And some interesting bugs came out of the soil, but we didn't get any moths. So we were kind of out of luck. But then, just a month later, we were on our way to Colorado and we stopped at a rest area and started wandering around the edge looking at leaf mines like we do. And we noticed some of those leaf mines on some arrowwoods there, and two of them had these associated bark flaps, which I knew there were a few species of Marmora that instead of wandering off to make a cocoon, they make this little incision at the end of their stem mine and spin their cocoon under the flap they create. And we peeled those off, and sure enough, there were cocoons with some frothy bubbles on them, but they were already empty. But now we knew all we had to do was go back to Nantucket in the 5th year of investigating this species and look for these bark flaps in June. So we did that. We spent about 5 hours looking and found 30 of these flaps. And we ended up getting 3 of these adult moths. And I wrote to Don Davis and I said, I know there are 100 species of gracilariids to describe and there's no particular reason to focus on this one, but I just spent 5 years trying to figure this out. If I write up a description of the external features, can you do the genitalia part, which is totally beyond me, but is critical for modern moth descriptions? And he said, sure. So there's a diagram of the male genitalia and its name is now Marmora viburnella. There are probably 100 species in the genus Marmora alone remaining to be described. Okay, so that's one moth family. Got 8 minutes to cover a few more. The family Areocraniidae emerge in the spring when leaves of oaks and other woody plants are just emerging, and they insert their eggs when the leaf is still expanding. And as the leaf continues to expand, there ends up being this hole that opens up at the beginning of the mine. Characteristic of this family. This particular species here starts out making a long linear mine. Some of them just make blotch mines, but all Areocraniids ultimately make this very squiggly frass, similar to some beetle mines. The larvae are legless, and after just feeding for a week or so, they drop to the ground and burrow down and don't emerge as adults until the following spring. And what we got from that scrub oak leaf on Nantucket was Areocraniella platyptera, which Don Davis had described in 1978 from just a couple of specimens that had been caught in Ithaca, New York, and its host and its leaf mine were unknown. Okay, Elachistidae, another family. There are over 100 species of Elachista, and most of them have never been reared, but as far as we know, they're all leaf miners of graminoids, so grasses, sedges, and rushes. This is a leaf mine I found on December 25th in Massachusetts, so you can really find leaf miners any time of year, wherever you are, if you know where to look, or if you're lucky. This is a sedge leaf. This red larva exited the leaf sometime in January after I brought it inside. This is the prepupa. It has spun some silk around itself and made a little girdle like you see on some butterfly chrysalises. And after it pupated, its shed skin is back here, and it looks like a miniature butterfly, like a swallowtail chrysalis with that little silk girdle. And there's the adult Elachista cuculata. The common name for that family is the grass miner moths, but they're not the only moths that mine leaves of grasses and sedges. If you see a mine on a sedge that looks clean like this, with all the frass pushed out a hole at the beginning, that is characteristic of the genus Cosmopteryx. And all of the species basically look like this, but the one that's on sedges around here is Cosmopteryx clemencella. Other mines that have no frass inside are made by Coleophora species, the case bearer moths. And the reason their mines don't have frass inside isn't that the larvae are pushing it out. It's because they live in little portable houses, and they attach that to the leaf and mine into it, but keeping their rear end in the the portable case, and then periodically they back up to the top of the case and dump their frass out the top. So this is a larva in its portable case. This one is on blackberry, so there's a little thorn coming out of its case. It's made of silk and tissue cut out of the leaf. This is the adult of the blackberry leaf miner, Coleophora cretaticostella. There are, I think, about 150 described species of case bearers and maybe 300 known undescribed species. This is a black birch leaf I found one autumn with lots of little case bearer mines on it. Flipping it over, I saw the case, but also some other smaller cases. And there's a neat story on this leaf, starting with here where the egg was laid and the larva made a tiny little blotch mine and then cut out the leaf from that mine. And that became its first case, portable case. So it walked over here maybe and fed a little bit, and then over here. And then when it got here, it attached its case to the leaf and mined in, made a larger mine from which it cut its next case. It then walked to the base of the leaf, making a lot of other mines along the way, abandoned that case, made a mine along here and cut that out. And that's the one that it's currently wearing. So here's its little head and legs poking out the front of the case and the leaf serrations along the back. It will overwinter in that case and then make one last case in the spring and then pupate inside that and then emerge as an adult. Right around now is when these are emerging. All right. Tisheriidae are kind of plain looking moths, but they have this a little pompadour hairstyle that's kind of distinctive. A lot of Coptotrichi species make mines that are clean because they have all the frass pushed out. And many of them are wrinkled, sort of like Phylloneurycter mines, but tend to be on the upper surface. And there's some that are formed along the edges of oak leaves, and as they curl over, the leaf ends up concealing a lot of the mine. And there's one that makes a similar mine on blackberry leaves. But there are others on oaks that instead of making those clean mines, they make trumpet-shaped mines with all the frass deposited inside. One of those species makes, for whatever reason, it decorates the ceiling of its mine with these little crescents. So it helps you identify the species. I don't know what else it does. Coptotrichi castanea. Too many vowels in that one. This is one of my favorite mines, Tisheria quersitella, another oak feeder, but it does push all of its frass out of the leaf, but it smears this purple substance on the ceiling of the mine, and it has this distinctive white retreat made of silk that it ends up pupating inside. All right, Heliozelidae, the shield bearer moths. The species of Coptodisca pretty much all look like this. They're among the tiniest moths, just 2 millimeters or so long. They're called shield bearers because when they finish making their mine, they cut out this little oval piece similar to what the case bearers do, but this is only to pupate inside. They're done feeding at that point. So they drop to the ground on a long strand of silk. This is the front end of the larva extending from its case. And then they attach that to a rock or a tree trunk or whatever is handy with a little button of silk, and that becomes their cocoon. I have probably 5 minutes left, if people don't mind if I go slightly over an hour. So these are some bunchberry leaves I found in Maine that I wasn't sure if I was looking at mines or not, just these funny red squiggles emanating from the bases of the leaves. But when I looked up close and backlit them, I could see that, in fact, there was some frass inside, and there's a larva right there. I had no idea what order or family of insect I was looking at here, but as they grew, they turned into blotch miners. And then when they cut out these pupal cases, I realized that they were heliozelids. There's the case there. And a case with a longitudinal ridge like that is characteristic of the genus Antispila. And when the adult emerges, the pupa pops out the end. And there's the adult Antispila cornifoliella. So there are 3 species in North America that are known to be dogwood leaf miners. And it turns out this species starts out making a linear mine before it makes a blotch. The other 2 just make blotch mines, but no one had mentioned that fact in the literature before. All right, the very first thing I showed in that video was a stigmella larva, the family Nepticulidae. They are maybe tied with Captodisca in being the tiniest moth. I think the very smallest moth in the world is a Nepticulid for sure. But they lay their eggs on the surface. There's a little shiny eggshell right there. They mostly make these linear mines with a distinct central frass line. And sometimes the color of the larva helps you identify them. So on oaks, Stigmella corsipulchella is the main one you see with yellow larvae. The others have green larvae around here. They all exit their mines and make these sesame seed-sized cocoons. And there's the adult Stigmella corsipulchella. And although there are a dozen or so Stigmella species on oaks, and they all make linear mines. There are different styles of linear mines. So here's one that makes a gradually widening mine with a narrow central fast line on this side of this leaf. But on this side, there's one that stays narrow throughout its length and is filled with frass all the way. And in a backlit view, you can see that this mine is closer to full depth. It's eating all of the mesophyll, whereas this one is more just an upper surface mine, eating the palisade mesophyll. The other main genus of Nepticulidae is Ectoedemia, and they tend to start out making a mine similar to a Stigmella mine, but then it turns into a blotch. This one is on a tupelo leaf, Ectoedemia nisifoliella. And this is my last moth family and genus, Buccolatrix. They make very tiny mines usually. This is a gamble oak leaf in Colorado. There's the mine there. This one had a larva inside, which it's very rare for me to find one with a larva inside because only the first instar is a leaf miner. In fact, by the time I got back to where I was staying to take a better picture of this, the larva had already popped out. And just to give you, although they look kind of like Stigmella mines, that same leaf with the 2 Stigmella mines also had a little Buccolatrix mine there, so much smaller. After popping out of the mine, they spin these little molting cocoons each time they need to shed their skin. And then in between molts, they're feeding externally like a regular caterpillar. This is called window feeding when they're eating all of the leaf tissue except one epidermis. So if you see window feeding associated with these molting cocoons, you know you're looking at Buccolatrix feeding sign. And this genus is known as the ribbed cocoon maker moths because the pupation cocoon has these distinct longitudinal ridges on it. And some species, before they spin that cocoon, they make this elaborate palisade of vertical silk pillars that I guess protects them from ants as they're spinning this more elaborate cocoon that they pupate inside. And there's the pupal skin poking out. This moth has already emerged. So all of the oak mining Buccolatrix species make very small mines, but there are some on the aster family that make longer mines that would be easier to confuse with a Stigmella mine. This is a groundsel bush leaf, Baccharis halimifolia. On the upper surface, you can see the mine and the window feeding. Flipping it over, you can see that the feeding is actually happening on the lower surface, and there is the larva doing the window feeding. When I was taking close-ups of this larva, I saw this dot here, which was somewhat concerning. This is where a parasitic wasp has inserted an egg. And while this larva is blithely feeding away here, there's a wasp larva biding its time until the caterpillar has spun its cocoon, and then the wasp larva rapidly develops, devours the wasp. The caterpillar spins its own cocoon inside the moth cocoon. The adult wasp chews its way out, and there's the adult. So this wasp genus is, they're specialists on root cocoon makers, but there's a parasite or many parasites for every kind of leaf miner. I'll just briefly show you a few others of those. So this huckleberry sawfly I showed you at the beginning has its own parasitic wasp that's spun a cocoon and already chewed its way out of this leaf. That's the leaf open to show its cocoon more clearly. And the adult, this is almost certainly an undescribed species. I sort of doubt it will be described in my lifetime, but maybe. There's not enough people working on parasitic wasps. The stigmella larvae, when they emerge from their mines, they cut a little narrow slit from the end. So if you see a little pinhole in the end, that's a sign that a little wasp emerged. In this case, this striking little eulophid, just 1 millimeter long. And some eulophids make, just before they pupate, the larva has saved up its poop its whole life, and then it puts it all out at the end, but they carefully arrange their poop in these little columns called meconial pillars, and those help protect the pupa from the collapsing leaf as it dries and crumples. And this is already an empty pupa here. But this is the wasp that came out of that. And then there are also lots of non-parasitic things that prey on leaf miners. This is an agromyzid fly mine in an oak leaf that I was taking a picture of. And then when I flipped it over, I noticed that there was this tiny ant that was almost done chewing this hole to extract larvae from it. The genus Temnothorax is known as acorn ants. They're so tiny that a whole colony can live inside of an acorn. And usually the ants that I see removing leaf miners are in this genus, but others will do it too. And my last predator here is a mason wasp, which is tearing open this leaf mine. All potter and mason wasps are caterpillar hunters that make little clay pots, or in this case, inside a hollow stem or some other cavity. They collect caterpillars and they sting them to paralyze them, and they stuff them somewhere and seal it up with clay after laying an egg on that. And that is the provision for their offspring. And this particular species is a specialist on leaf mining insects. Okay, on that note, I will be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks for bearing with me.
Wow, this is a fantastic and mysterious world you've just launched us into. There are so many questions.
Okay, I see there are 75 or so.
Yeah, there's one that did stand out to me by Marcy. That is, do most or all leaf miners specialize on a plant species, or might they be amiable to another species in the same genus?
Most leaf miners are host genus specific rather than species specific. There are some that are only on one plant species. There are some that will be on a plant tribe or family, and there's a very small number that are total generalists. But yeah, the vast majority will be restricted to one plant genus, which is why my book is largely set up, it's arranged by plant taxonomy. So you look up the genus of the plant you have, and then there's a dichotomous key to the mines you could find on that plant genus.
There are If anyone would like to ask Charley directly, you can raise your hand within Zoom. There are a few questions here. What is, by Kyla, is there a benefit to the larvae feeding belly up or on their side?
I haven't really thought about that. It's just kind of what they do. There may well be, but I'm not sure what it might be.
Some future research, I see.
Yeah.
Are there, and I'm assuming you can see the larvae with the naked eye?
Yeah. They might be just 2 millimeters long or so, so you have to look closely, but generally I can, and my vision isn't that great.
Which goes into the kind of lens you use for your pictures. What is your camera setup?
This one here, which is, yeah, let's see, I can stop sharing. You see that better there. So this is the Canon MPE 65, which when it's like this, the field of view is 22 millimeters. And then when you telescope it out like that, the field of view is 4 millimeters.
Whoa.
It's a very unversatile lens because there's no focus on it. You just have to be the right distance from your subject, which the distance is about like that. So it's very hard to sneak up on things with it. But that's what I use for most of the pictures you saw in this slideshow.
Cool. So for folks who use iNaturalist, what are some essential photos we should be taking for you to identify if you come across them? Excellent
question. So first thing is definitely, if you don't know what the host plant is, take pictures to show that someone else might be able to identify the plant. And then a clear view of the upper surface. I mean, the ideal things would be upper surface, lower surface, and a backlit view, so you can see maybe the outline of the larva and the frass pattern. And when I'm in the field, I take backlit pictures by holding the leaf up to the sun. And if you use spot metering, that can help you get the right light balance when you're doing that. But yeah, those are the key things to do. Even if you don't think there's anything to see on the underside of the leaf, it's still good to take a picture of it. There might be some detail you're missing, or just the fact that you can't see it on the underside is good information.
Cool. Scott has a question, but I am unable to give him the ability for his audio to be turned on. I don't know what's going on with Zoom, but Scott, if you wanted to type in your question, that might work. Zoom's giving me some technical difficulties here. My apologies. But we are going to take just a few more questions here as we are over the hour. I just want to say how fascinating this is. I had no idea this was these little guys were munching away on leaves and moths came out.
I see there are several questions about rearing. So, well, the short answer is I have a page on my website that goes into my techniques. But basically, I collect leaf miners in little vials like this, and that generally is enough to keep the leaf from drying out sometimes. As in this case, I put a little piece of toilet paper that's crumpled up with a few drops of water on it to help keep the leaf from drying out. And if it's something that needs to burrow into soil, I use anything from a baby food jar to say a peanut butter jar, and I make a mixture of sand and peat, maybe an inch deep, for the larva to burrow into. And if it's something that has to overwinter in the soil, then I put it in the refrigerator over the winter, somewhere between freezing and 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, or below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And that for a few months, and then take it out. I often put them in like early November, take them out at the end of February, something like that. that's the basics of it. Let's see, any common plants I haven't found leaf miners on. The number of plants without leaf miners is very small, but there are some conspicuous plants with conspicuously large leaves that no one has found leaf mines on include redbud and spicebush. A lot of things in the arum family, like Jack in the Pulpit, seem like someone should be mining those, but there just isn't anything. But every once in a while, there's something that has nothing on it, and then one day there is something on it. That happened to me with blue-eyed grass last year. Well, someone else found them first, but then when I had been looking for years, and then when she found them, I looked and found some too. That was another Marmora species. But anyway, hopefully I'll be able to look at all these comments later, and I don't know how to deal with that exactly, but I see lots of people are asking questions and there's no way to respond to them all.
Yeah, we will be sending out an email after this webinar with a lot of resources for you to spend time with, especially a link to Charley's book. So there may be an opportunity to answer some questions and add them into the email. Would that be possible, Charley?
Sure. Oh, and I should mention, since I didn't do it just now, going through a couple examples with my keys, I will, through the Eagle Hill Institute, starting at the end of July, I'll be doing a webinar that's spread over 5 consecutive Saturdays, where I'll have a little slideshow at the beginning, different from this one. And then the rest of the course will be, people will have a week to go collect mines and try keying them out, and then we'll get together and work through them, any problem mines. So that's an option. And Corey will be sending out an email that has a link to that course if anyone's interested.
Yeah, and this webinar is being recorded, so there will be a chance to view it, and that will also be detailed within the email. As you exit, if you would be so kind as to fill out the post-webinar survey, that'll help Charley with future webinars or presentations, and just we love to get some feedback on the platform and the way we conduct webinars like this. And if you don't find it, it'll be in the email. But I just want to thank you all for participating, and I want to thank Charley especially for presenting on this most fascinating subject of leaf miners. And I hope we can all stay connected, especially on iNaturalist. Please sign up for iNaturalist if you haven't, but I guess we'll see you out there in the field.
And there is a Leaf Miners of North America project that I've created on iNaturalist. So if you post things to that project, I will see them. Although I'm falling a little bit behind right now because leaf mines are getting more and more popular on iNaturalist, but I'll get to them eventually.
Awesome. So I guess we'll say goodnight for now. And again, thank you, Charley, and thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
All right, have a good night, everyone.